Chapter 1. The First Cases. P.S. Dr. Aaron Calloway's Journal. Entry 1. They never tell you how much of medicine is routine. How after years of diagnosing the same colds, stitching the same cuts, and comforting the same terrified parents, the extraordinary can lose its edge. But every now and then, the ordinary shatters like glass, and you're left scrambling to pick up the pieces before they slice you open. That's how it started. Just another Tuesday. I was in my office at Greenbridge Memorial Hospital, flipping through lab reports, when the emergency pager buzzed. We'd been unusually busy all morning, a steady flow of patients arriving with vague complaints, fevers, fatigue, odd skin rashes. My colleague, Elaine Vickers, had joked that flu season had come early. I laughed it off too, but now, with the pager lighting up like a Christmas tree, a sliver of unease worked its way under my skin. The ER was chaos. Nurses rushed between curtained beds, voices taut with urgency. I flagged down a nurse, Sarah, who barely spared me a glance as she juggled charts. "What's going on?" I asked. "Group from the scrapyard," she said, exhaling sharply. "Some kind of infection. Rash, boils, lesions. Hell, a few of them are septic." That stopped me cold. Septic? From skin rashes? I grabbed a pair of gloves and headed for the nearest bed. The patient was a man in his 40s, his face slick with sweat and twisted in pain. His arms were covered in angry red welts, the skin around them inflamed and weeping. As I leaned closer, the smell hit me. A sharp, acrid stench like rust and decay. "What happened?" I asked, trying to keep my tone steady. The man wheezed, his words slurring. "Just been working at the yard. It's nothing, just a cut." I glanced at his arm, spotting a shallow scratch beneath the rash. It looked benign enough, but the skin around it was swollen, almost pulsing with heat. Something was wrong. Very wrong. "Get him on a broad-spectrum antibiotic," I told Sarah, "and run a full panel, CBC, CRP, blood cultures, the works. I want to know what we're dealing with." By the time I reached the second patient, a young woman in her 20s, my unease had blossomed into full-fledged dread. Her rash was even worse. Open sores riddled her arms and legs, and she was shivering despite the warm room. "I only touched it," she murmured when I asked her what happened. "That stupid rusty thing, the cylinder." 5 patients, 1 connection. By noon, we had admitted 5 patients from the scrapyard, all with the same symptoms: fever, rapidly spreading lesions and signs of sepsis. The labs came back with the same baffling results. Nothing unusual, no pathogens we could identify, no cultures growing. And yet, their infections were progressing faster than anything I'd ever seen. By mid-afternoon, the first patient went into septic shock. We managed to stabilize him, but his skin had begun to slough off in patches, revealing raw, angry tissue beneath. Antibiotics weren't touching it. "What the hell are we dealing with?" Elaine asked, her face pale as she joined me by the patient's bed. I didn't have an answer. My mind churned with possibilities. PERSA? Necrotizing fasciitis? Some kind of toxin? But none of it fit. These patients weren't just sick. Their bodies were breaking down as if something inside them was consuming them. The cylinder. Huh. It wasn't until the scrapyard owner arrived that the pieces began to fall into place. Mr. Grayson was an older man, his hands trembling as he clutched his stomach and leaned against the triage desk. "I've been feeling off since yesterday," he said, his voice hoarse. "But my guys are worse. I think it's that thing we brought in." "What thing?" I asked sharply, stepping closer. "Some old gas cylinder," he muttered. "Bought it at the auction. Thing was rusted to hell, but the boys said it had this weird sheen inside when they opened it. Didn't think much of it." A rusted gas cylinder. I felt a chill creep up my spine. "Where is it now?" Grayson shrugged. Still, at the, I guess. Why?" I didn't answer. My thoughts were racing. Could the cylinder be the source? Toxin, maybe? Or some kind of unknown contaminant? Whatever it was, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. The pattern emerges. By the time my shift ended, 3 more patients had come in, each presenting with the same symptoms. All had been at the scrapyard within the last 48 hours, and all were getting worse. Fast. Back in my office, I stared at the patient charts spread across my desk. The rapid onset, the resistance to treatment, the shared exposure point. It all pointed to something infectious, something unlike anything I'd ever seen. And yet no pathogen, no explanation. The hospital's hum of activity seemed to close in around me, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. For the first time in years, I felt something I thought I'd left behind long ago. Fear. Not for me, but for the patients, for the staff, for everyone who might walk through those doors tomorrow. I didn't know what we were dealing with, but I knew it wasn't routine. And it was just beginning. Chapter 2. A Curious Relic. Dr. Aaron Calloway's Journal. Entry 2. Curiosity is a double-edged sword in medicine. It drives discovery, but it also pushes you closer to things better left untouched. I should have remembered that when I stepped into the scrapyard that day. The air at Grayson's Metalworks hung heavy with the scent of oil and rust, a metallic tang that seemed to coat my throat. The sun glared off twisted heaps of machinery and scrap, casting long, jagged shadows that made the place feel like a graveyard for forgotten things. I tightened my gloves and pulled my mask higher, trying not to think about the patients back at Greenbridge Memorial. Their blistering skin, their boiling fevers. "Dr. Calloway!" A gruff voice called out, snapping me from my thoughts. I turned to see Mr. Grayson shuffling toward me, his skin pale and slick with sweat, his cough rattled in his chest, and dark circles underlined his eyes like bruises. "Thanks for coming," he wheezed. "I told your nurse about that thing we found. Figured you'd want to see it." "Where is it?" I asked. He jerked a thumb over his shoulder. "Back by the compactor. The boys don't want to go near it no more. Said it's bad luck." Bad luck. I didn't believe in such things, but as I followed him through the scrapyard, stepping over discarded tires and twisted steel, I couldn't shake the sense of unease crawling up my spine. We rounded a corner and there it was. The cylinder. The gas cylinder sat upright on a pallet, its surface a patchwork of flaking rust and strange, oily streaks. It wasn't large, maybe 3 feet tall, but it seemed to radiate something, a quiet menace that made the air feel colder. "It's been leaking," Grayson said, pointing to a hairline crack along the side. As he spoke, I noticed a faint wisp of vapor curling from the fissure, vanishing into the air like ghostly breath. The sheen inside, he'd mentioned, an iridescent film, was visible along the edges of the crack. It shimmered faintly, almost hypnotically. "You said this was from an auction?" I asked, forcing my eyes away from the cylinder. Grayson nodded. "Yeah. Old estate sale up in Cedar Hollow. Junk mostly, but I thought this thing might fetch a price. Didn't realize it'd make my guys sick." "How long has it been here?" 4 days, give or take. The boys unloaded it by hand. I jotted down notes, trying to ignore the knot tightening in my stomach. 4 days. Long enough for the bacteria, or whatever it was, to spread. "Did you touch it directly?" Grayson looked at me like I'd asked if he licked it. "Course not, I'm not stupid." I turned back to the cylinder, leaning closer without touching it. My mask filtered most of the smell, but there was still an underlying acrid stench, sharp and unnatural. Collecting evidence. I knelt beside the cylinder, pulling out a sterile swab and a sample container from my kit. Carefully, I ran the swab along the edge of the crack, where the vapor was most concentrated. The material felt strangely warm, almost alive through the gloves. Next, I scraped a bit of rust from the surface and sealed it in a second container. I knew we'd need to test for chemical contaminants, maybe even radiation, though I doubted the latter. As I packed my kit, a chill breeze swept through the yard, stirring the vapor into a faint plume. My unease deepened. The vapor was so fine it was almost invisible, a perfect vector for transmission. "Dr. Calloway," Grayson said, breaking the silence. "You think this thing's what made my boys sick?" I straightened, meeting his bloodshot eyes. "I think it's a strong possibility. We'll need to run tests to be sure." "You gonna take it with you?" "No," I said quickly. "It's safer here until we know more. Keep it isolated and don't let anyone else near it. Understood?" Grayson nodded reluctantly, and I turned to leave. The walk away. As I retraced my steps through the scrapyard, the weight of what I'd seen gnawed at me. The cylinder wasn't just a piece of scrap. It was a Pandora's box, leaking something unseen and malevolent into the world. I kept my mask and gloves on until I reached my car, stripping them off carefully and sealing them in a biohazard bag. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. By the time I arrived back at the hospital, the unease had solidified into something heavier. The first patient was coding in the ICU, and Elaine's message was waiting for me. 3 new cases admitted, symptoms progressing faster than expected. I washed my hands twice before stepping inside. I told myself I was being cautious, but deep down, I already knew the truth. Whatever had started at that scrapyard wasn't staying there. And as I hung up my coat, I didn't notice the faint sheen of rust dust clinging to the cuffs of my sleeves. End of entry. Chapter 3, The Spread Begins. Aaron Calloway's journal entry. First, the hospital has always been a place of controlled chaos. People arrive in pain, in fear, and desperation, and we, the staff, meet them with calm efficiency. That's the illusion we sell, that we're in control. Today, that illusion shattered. The first sign that something was truly wrong came just after dawn. I'd been up all night in the lab, analyzing the samples from the scrapyard. The results were baffling. No identifiable pathogen, no growth in the cultures. But the chemical analysis of the vapor, that told a different story. It was packed with volatile compounds I couldn't even name. And something else, something organic. My train of thought was interrupted by a crash from down the hall. I rushed out, nearly colliding with Sarah, one of the ER nurses. She was pale, her eyes glassy with fear. "It's G.R. Vickers," she gasped. My stomach dropped. Elaine. I found Elaine in one of the staff break rooms, slumped against the counter. Her hands were trembling, and her face was flushed with fever. Red welts had begun to bloom along her neck and arms, creeping like ivy. "Elaine," I said, crouching beside her, "how long have you been feeling like this?" "Started last night," she murmured, her voice weak. "Thought it was just stress. Heron, it's burning. My skin feels like it's on fire." I checked her vitals. Rapid heart rate, shallow breathing. The same symptoms I'd seen in the scrapyard patients. My chest tightened as I noticed her hands. The skin around her fingertips was cracked and bleeding. She'd been touching patients all day yesterday. "We'll get you isolated," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're going to be okay." But the look she gave me told me she didn't believe it. A new nightmare. By mid-morning, the hospital was a war zone. Half the ER staff were showing symptoms, fevers, rashes, and in some cases, lesions so severe they couldn't even hold a pen. The patients were worse. The infection spread through their bodies like wildfire, turning skin necrotic and pushing them towards septic shock. But it wasn't just the patients. It wasn't just airborne. The infection was everywhere. I realized it when I saw one of the janitors, Martin, struggling to breathe in the supply closet. He hadn't been near any patients, but his forearms were mottled with the same angry rash I'd seen on Elaine. "What have you touched today?" I demanded. "Everything," he croaked. "The counters, the gurneys, the damn door handles." It hit me like a punch to the chest. The infection wasn't just airborne, it was clinging to surfaces. It was on everything we touched, everything we brushed against. The lockdown. I barely had time to process this realization before the announcement blared over the intercom. Staff and patients are now under mandatory quarantine. No one is to leave the premises until further notice. This is a code black biohazard lockdown. The words hung in the air like the crack of a judge's gavel. I rushed to the hospital's main entrance, where a group of staff and visitors were already gathered, staring at the locked double doors. Beyond them, armed security guards in hazmat suits had set up a perimeter. A young nurse turned to me, her face stricken. "Dr. Calloway, what's happening? Why won't they let us leave?" I took a deep breath, trying to suppress the rising panic in my chest. "There's an infection spreading," I said carefully. "We're trying to contain it. If we leave, we risk exposing others." Her eyes widened. "You mean we're trapped here?" I didn't answer. Paranoia sets in. As the hours dragged on, the hospital descended into a kind of madness. Staff began to turn on each other, accusing colleagues of being careless or worse, of hiding symptoms. The infected were quarantined in the West Wing, but the rest of us knew it was only a matter of time before the infection reached us too. I saw it in the way people avoided eye contact, in the way they scrubbed their hands raw at every sink. Even I wasn't immune to the paranoia. Every itch, every bead of sweat felt like the start of something sinister. The spread escalates. By evening, the West Wing had become unrecognizable. Patients and staff alike writhed in their beds, their bodies consumed by the infection. The lesions had evolved into something almost alien, deep, blackened sores that oozed a foul-smelling fluid. Elaine was among them. She gripped my hand as I checked her vitals, her eyes dull with fever. "Heron," she whispered, "you need to stop this. You need to find a way." I nodded, but I didn't know if I believed myself. Trapped. That night, I sat alone in my office, staring at the samples I'd brought back from the scrapyard. My gloves, my mask, my clothes. They were all contaminated now. Every precaution we'd taken had been futile. The cylinder from the scrapyard had unleashed something we couldn't control, couldn't fight, and now we were trapped with it, sealed inside a hospital that had become a petri dish of horrors. I knew I had to act, but the weight of the situation pressed down on me like a vice. If I failed, this infection wouldn't stay confined to Greenbridge Memorial. It would spread to the city, to the state, to the world. The stakes had never been higher. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I was already infected. Chapter 4. Town on the Brink. D.A. Karen, Calloway's Journal, Entry 4. Cedar Hollow wasn't just on the brink. It was already tipping into the abyss. The first reports came in while I was reviewing a new batch of patient charts, each one more horrifying than the last. A call from the county health department cut through the chaos like a scalpel. "We're seeing cases in Cedar Hollow," the official on the other end said. His voice was clipped, professional, but I could hear the edge of fear beneath it. "Dozens so far. They're describing rashes, lesions, and fever, just like what you've got in Greenbridge." My stomach churned. Cedar Hollow, the town where Grayson's scrapyard had bought the cursed gas cylinder. "Have you quarantined the town?" I asked, gripping the phone tighter. "We're working on it," he replied, "but the town's resisting. They're scared, angry. This isn't going to go smoothly." The quarantine. By noon, Cedar Hollow was sealed off. Government vehicles rolled into the streets, barricades rose, and armed guards in hazmat suits took their positions. To the residents, it must have looked like a scene ripped from some dystopian nightmare. News helicopters buzzed overhead, capturing shots of desperate families pleading with soldiers at the barricades. Children cried. Mothers screamed. People waved their arms, begging for help, for answers, for someone to let them out. But the barricades didn't budge. Inside the hospital, I watched the coverage in silence, my colleagues gathering around the TV in the break room. The chaos on the screen felt like a prelude to what awaited us inside our own walls. "They're trapped," whispered Sarah, the nurse who had been helping me triage the infected. "Just like us." I didn't reply. I didn't have the heart to tell her that Cedar Hollow's isolation was the only thing keeping this nightmare from spilling out into the world. A town divided. The next day, reports from Cedar Hollow began filtering in. The infection was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated. Without the resources of a hospital, people were dying in their homes, their bodies abandoned in backyards or along the streets. And then the paranoia set in. They say it spreads through touch, one report claimed. People are wrapping their hands in plastic bags, refusing to shake hands or hug their own families. Another described townsfolk attacking a neighbor suspected of being the first to get sick. They burned his house down, screaming that he'd brought the plague upon them. "Witch hunts," Elaine murmured when I shared the reports. She was still confined to the quarantine wing, her voice weak but her mind sharp as ever. "That's what happens when people don't understand. Fear turns into hate. Always has." I nodded, but her words unsettled me. How long before fear turned into hate within these walls, too? Desperation breeds madness. By evening, Cedar Hollow had descended into chaos. Families turned on each other, husbands accusing wives, parents blaming children. A man was beaten unconscious in the town square for sneezing. I received a frantic voicemail from a local doctor, Dr. Fred Harris, who had been trying to treat the infected with limited supplies. "Aaron," his voice crackled through the static, I can't handle this alone. People are dying faster than I can see them. They're breaking into my clinic, demanding antibiotics, but nothing's working. And now..." He broke off, and I heard distant yelling in the background. When he returned, his voice was shaking. "And now they're saying it's my fault. They think I brought this on them. If you get this, send help. Please." The message ended abruptly. The weight of guilt. I sat in my office, listening to that voicemail over and over, each replay etching Fred's desperation deeper into my mind. I should have felt relief that Cedar Hollow was locked down, that the infection was contained. I didn't feel relief, I felt guilt. I thought of the cylinder sitting in Grayson's scrapyard, its rusty surface leaking death into the air. I thought of the auction where it had been sold, of the hands it had passed through before landing in that quiet town. And I thought of the families trapped inside Cedar Hollow, their lives crumbling because no one had stopped this sooner. Breaking news. The next morning, the TV in the break room bled with updates. Residents in Cedar Hollow were accusing each other of spreading the mysterious infection, the anchor said. Officials have yet to identify the source. The death toll continues to rise, and resources inside the quarantine zone are reportedly running low. The screen cut to footage of a young woman screaming at a soldier stationed at the barricade. "My baby's sick," she cried, clutching a limp toddler in her arms. "You can't keep us in here. Let us out, please. For God's sake, let us out." The soldier stood still, a faceless figure in a hazmat suit, his rifle slung across his chest. I turned away, unable to watch any more. The infection tightens its grip. In Cedar Hollow, the infection was spreading like wildfire. In Greenbridge Memorial, it was moving just as fast. And in the middle of it all, I stood paralyzed, torn between my duty to the hospital and my guilt over Cedar Hollow. I knew one thing for certain: the cylinder was the key. It had unleashed this nightmare, and until we understood it, we were fighting blind. But the real question, the one I didn't dare voice, was how many of us would be left alive to find the answers. End of entry. Chapter 5. The Silent Terror. D.R. Aaron Calloway's Journal, Entry 5. They looked healthy. That's what haunted me most. The ones walking through the hallways, helping to calm patients, touching IV stands, and handing out syringes, they didn't have the fever, the rashes, or the lesions. But they were spreading it. And none of us realized it until it was too late. The first inkling came during a routine debrief with Sarah. She'd been working in the West Wing, helping triage the worsening cases. By now, nearly every patient had some form of the infection, rashes, septic wounds, and escalating organ failure. "I've been scrubbing down everything after every patient," she said, her voice strained. "But it's like it doesn't matter. The infection just keeps spreading." Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, and I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "Are you feeling okay?" I asked. She blinked, caught off guard. "I'm fine," she replied. "Tired, but fine." And she was fine, or so I thought. No rashes, no fever. But as I watched her turn to sanitize the counters, her gloved hands brushed a monitor, the patient's bed frame, the curtain. A creeping thought curled in the back of my mind. The carriers. Sarah wasn't the only one. I started watching people more closely. The janitors mopping floors, the nurses swapping out IV bags, the staff cradling cups of coffee with gloved hands. They moved quickly, methodically, their faces pale with stress, but their bodies seemingly untouched by the infection. But everywhere they went, the infection followed. It was Elaine who helped me piece it together. I visited her in the quarantine wing, where her fever had broken, but the welts on her skin remained raw and angry. She was in pain, but her mind was as sharp as ever. "You thinking about vectors?" she said, watching me jot down notes at her bedside. "I think some of the staff are spreading it," I admitted. "They're asymptomatic, but the infection seems to trail them." Elaine nodded, her expression grim. "Carriers. The bacterium must be clinging to their skin, thriving without making them sick. They're vectors without knowing it." Her words sent a chill through me. If that was true, it meant no one was safe, not even those who thought they were. The mutated bacterium. Back in the lab, my team worked around the clock to analyze samples from the infected. The bacterium we'd isolated wasn't like anything we'd seen before. It's brilliant, Jar Harper, one of our microbiologists, murmured as he peered into the microscope. His tone wasn't admiration, it was fear. "This thing adapts faster than anything I've studied. It's built to survive." The bacterium thrived on human skin flora, integrating itself seamlessly into the natural microbiota. Antibiotics didn't touch it. Heat and chemical disinfectants only slowed it down. And, most terrifying of all, it wasn't just surviving, it was evolving. "Every sample we take shows slight genetic differences," Harper said, turning to me. "It's mutating with every host. Whatever's in that cylinder is driving this evolution." The cylinder arrives. The decision to bring the cylinder to the hospital was a mistake. The SCP Foundation had been notified, but they were still days away from sending a specialized containment team. In the meantime, I pushed for the cylinder to be isolated in our secure biohazard lab, convinced that studying it up close would give us answers. Grayson himself delivered it, his condition deteriorating by the hour. He was barely coherent as he and 2 orderlies wheeled the rusted cylinder into the lab, the vapor curling faintly from its fissures. "You shouldn't have brought this thing here," he muttered, before collapsing into a fit of coughing. The cylinder sat in the center of the lab, a looming malignant presence. Even with the lab's ventilation system running at full capacity, I could feel its contamination seeping into the air. The spiral. Within hours, the infection rate doubled. It was as if the cylinder's presence accelerated the bacteria's spread. Patients who had been stable began crashing. Staff who had shown no symptoms suddenly developed fevers and lesions. And then there were the carriers. I caught Sarah disinfecting a hallway outside the quarantine wing. Her movements precise, almost robotic. "Sarah, have you been tested today?" I asked, stepping into her path. She looked up, startled. "I told you, I'm fine." But I saw it then, faint red streaks on the back of her neck, almost hidden by her collar. "Take off your gloves," I said, my voice hardening. She hesitated, her hands trembling. "Sarah?" I pressed. Reluctantly, she peeled them off, revealing cracked, reddened skin. "You're infected," I said, my chest tightening. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, I've been so careful." But it didn't matter. She had become a part of the silent terror. A growing horror. The cylinder was in just the source. It was feeding the infection, amplifying it, creating something new. I stood in the lab that night, staring at the rusted relic, its vapor curling like smoke from a fire we couldn't extinguish. My reflection shimmered faintly on its iridescent surface, and I felt the weight of my failure pressing down. We were losing. The hospital was becoming an incubator, a breeding ground for the bacterium, and as I traced the path of its spread, I realized the truth. The infection wasn't just in the air. It wasn't just on the surfaces. It was on us. It was in us. And there was no way to stop it. End of entry. Chapter 6. A Desperate Search. J.R.R. Calloway's Journal Entry 6. The cylinder sat in the center of the containment lab like a predator, waiting to strike. Its rusted surface gleamed faintly under the sterile overhead lights, each crack and blemish an unspoken threat. This was the epicenter, the Pandora's box that had unleashed chaos on Greenbridge Memorial and Cedar Hollow beyond. And now, here we were, standing in its shadow, trying to make sense of the madness it had brought. It was the most dangerous decision I'd ever made to bring this thing here, into the very heart of a hospital already collapsing under its weight. But I didn't see another way. Answers weren't just important. They were the only thing that could save us. If they even existed. The sealed lab. had no properties of discrete experience being exposed. It loomed in the center, hooked up to a tangle of ventilation systems and chemical isolation equipment. I stood with Dr. Harper, our microbiologist, and 2 lab techs, their faces pale and eyes darting toward the cylinder like it might leap off the table. We were all wrapped in layers of biohazard gear, the thick material hot and claustrophobic, but no one dared complain. "Let's begin," I said, my voice muffled through the mask. Harper nodded, his gloved hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the monitoring equipment. "If this thing could talk," he muttered, "I wonder what it would say." I didn't answer. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The first observations. Our initial tests confirmed what we already suspected. The cylinder was leaking a gas, unlike anything we'd ever encountered. "It's not just volatile," Harper said, pointing to the spectrometer readings. "It's reactive. It doesn't just hang in the air. It seeks out biological material. Specifically bacteria," I added, studying the data. We ran samples through the gas chamber, exposing harmless strains of skin flora to its vapor. Within minutes, the bacteria began to mutate. Cells divided at an accelerated rate, their structures warping into something grotesque. "Look at this," Harper said, leaning over the microscope. His voice trembled. "It's adapting. These microbes, they're building resistance to everything we throw at them." I peered through the lens, my stomach turning. The bacteria weren't just surviving, they were thriving. Their cell walls had thickened, their reproductive cycles shortened. They'd become superbugs, weapons in microscopic form. "Whatever's in that gas," Harper said, "it's selecting for survivability. It's like natural selection on steroids." The mutagenic gas. The more we studied the gas, the more it defied explanation. "It's not just chemical," one of the techs said, pointing to an analysis screen. "There's a biological component to it, but it's not alive. It's more like a blueprint." "A blueprint for what?" I asked. "For destruction," Harper said grimly. "This thing doesn't just mutate bacteria. It optimizes them. It creates pathogens that are perfectly designed to spread, infect, and kill." I stared at the cylinder, its rusted surface mocking me with its stillness. "Where the hell did this thing come from?" I asked aloud, more to myself than anyone else. No one had an answer. Origins unknown. We tried tracing the cylinder's origins, sifting through the auction records provided by Grayson. The information was sparse. It had come from an estate sale in Cedar Hollow, part of a collection of miscellaneous items. The previous owner was listed as deceased, no relatives, no history of industrial use. "It's like it just appeared out of nowhere," Harper said, frustration bleeding into his voice. "Or someone wanted it to disappear," I replied, my thoughts darkening. The cost of knowledge. Hours turned into days as we worked in the containment lab, our focus narrowing on the gas. Each discovery felt like a step closer to unraveling the mystery, but also a step closer to understanding just how hopeless our situation was. Every test confirmed the same horrifying truth. The gas wasn't just dangerous, it was apocalyptic. "This isn't an accident," Harper said one night, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me with haunted eyes. "This thing wasn't built to leak. It was built to spread. A growing catastrophe." Despite the containment measures, the infection outside the lab was worsening. Every day, more staff fell ill. The hospital corridors were nearly silent now, the once frenetic energy replaced by an eerie stillness. And through it all, the cylinder remained, watching, waiting. As I prepared to leave the lab that night, Harper stopped me. "You know this thing is going to kill us all," he said. I met his gaze, the weight of his words pressing down on me. "And if we stop it first," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure I believed them. The cylinder wasn't just a relic, it was a weapon. And we were running out of time. End of entry. Chapter 7. Fractured Sanity. Jerian Calloway's Journal, Entry 7. When the screams stopped, the silence was worse. The infection had hollowed out Greenbridge Memorial. Patients who weren't already dead were moaning in agony, their bodies grotesque shells of what they once were. Staff shuffled through the hallways like ghosts, their eyes empty, their hands trembling. The weight of the cylinder in the containment lab seemed to press on all of us, a silent reminder of what was coming. The hospital was dying, and so were we. The breaking point. I first noticed the shift in the staff during a routine check-in with Elaine. Her fever had spiked again, and the lesions on her arms were spreading despite the best care we could offer. She still managed to speak, her voice rasping like wind through cracked glass. "Heron," she whispered, her fingers clutching mine weakly. "You've got to keep them together. The staff, they're cracking." I didn't have the heart to tell her she was right. That morning, I had overheard two doctors in the break room, their voices low but sharp. "What's the point?" one had said. "We can't save them, they're just carriers now. Keeping them alive is risking everyone else." "They're still people," the other had snapped. "We don't just give up." "People?" The first one had laughed bitterly. "You've seen what this thing does. You know how it ends." I'd walked away before I could hear more, but the seed of their conversation stayed with me. The proposal? It didn't take long for the whispers to become a full-blown confrontation. I was making rounds when Dr. Fletcher, a senior surgeon with decades of experience, cornered me outside the ICU. His face was pale, his hands fidgeting, a man pushed to the edge of his sanity. "We need to talk," he said. I nodded, following him to the supply room. "I know you're trying to hold this together," he began, pacing like a caged animal. "But you've seen the numbers. This infection, whatever it is, it doesn't stop. It doesn't care what we do." "What are you suggesting?" I asked, though I already knew. He stopped, meeting my gaze with wild, desperate eyes. "We need to start euthanizing the infected." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "No," I said firmly. "They're already gone, Calloway," Fletcher argued. "You've seen it yourself. Their bodies are falling apart. The ones who are still lucid, They're suffering. You're condemning them to die slowly. And worse, they're a risk to the rest of us. They're human beings, I snapped. We don't decide when they die. We're doctors, he countered, his voice rising. It's our job to minimize harm, letting them stay alive, letting this thing spread. That's harm. The argument boiled over. By the time we left the supply room, half the staff was involved, shouting, accusing, breaking apart. The fight. It happened in the ICU. One of Fletcher's supporters, a young resident named Patel, tried to inject a sedative into an infected patient without authorization. A nurse caught him, and all hell broke loose. "What are you doing?" the nurse screamed, grabbing his arm. "Ah, she's gone," Patel shouted back. "I'm doing what has to be done." The patient, barely conscious, moaned weakly as Patel and the nurse struggled. A syringe clattered to the floor. Staff rushed in, pulling them apart, their voices rising in panic and anger. "Stop it!" I roared, stepping between them. "This isn't how we do things." Patel turned to me, his eyes blazing. "Then how do we do things, Calloway? We're not saving anyone. We're just waiting to die." His words echoed through the ward, silencing everyone. The weight of leadership. After the fight, I gathered the remaining staff in the cafeteria. It was a pathetic sight. Doctors, nurses, and techs slumped in chairs, their faces hollow, their scrubs stained with sweat and blood. "I know you're scared," I began, my voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside me. "I am too. But we cannot, will not turn on each other. That's exactly what this thing wants. It spreads through fear, through desperation. We have to be better than that." I saw Fletcher scowling in the back of the room, but I ignored him. These patients, these people, are depending on us. Even if we can't save them, we can give them dignity, we can give them hope. And as long as there's a chance, any chance, we owe it to them to keep fighting. The room was silent. I didn't know if they believed me. Hell, I didn't know if I believed myself. The doubt creeps in. That night, I returned to my office and scrubbed my hands until my skin was raw. Every itch, every bead of sweat felt like a warning sign. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, searching for the telltale red streaks, the lesions that would mark me as one of them. Nothing. But I didn't feel relieved. I felt hollow. Because deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time. We were all infected. Maybe not in body, but in mind, in spirit, in sanity. The cylinder in the lab had done more than release a mutagenic gas. It had unleashed something primal, something that tore at the fabric of who we were. And as I sat there in the silence, I wondered how much longer I could keep fighting before it tore me apart too. End of entry. Chapter 8. Cedar Hollow Collapses. Jor Aaron Calloway's Journal, Entry 8. Cedar Hollow was the warning we didn't heed. The infection spread through the town like wildfire, consuming it in waves of paranoia and despair. At Greenbridge, we watched from a distance, powerless to intervene, as the threads of humanity unraveled just a few miles away. When the first images leaked online, I could barely believe what I was seeing. Crowds had gathered in the streets, fists flying and screams echoing, as neighbors turned against one another, Stores were looted, homes were torched, and bodies lay abandoned on sidewalks. The infection wasn't just devouring their bodies, it was consuming their souls. The collapse of trust. The reports that filtered in painted a picture of utter chaos. I haven't seen my kids in days. One call from a Cedar Hollow nurse crackled through the hospital's emergency line. They locked themselves in their rooms because they're afraid of me. They think I'm contagious. Another voice, frantic and hoarse. They're saying the mayor is hoarding medicine. People are storming his house. The town had become a war zone. No one trusted anyone. Families were tearing themselves apart over accusations of who brought the infection home. And the infection itself? It had taken a new turn. "Dr. Calloway," a colleague said, thrusting a tablet into my hands. On the screen was a video from a Cedar Hollow resident, a shaky recording of a neighbor in his backyard. The man stood barefoot on the grass, his skin covered in angry open sores. He swayed as if drunk, muttering to himself. Then, without warning, he collapsed. "Wasn't dead," the colleague said grimly. "The infection's affecting their nervous systems now. Seizures, disorientation. It's evolving again." The mother's plea. It was just past midnight when the hospital's landline rang, cutting through the oppressive quiet of the hallways. I answered it, expecting another report or demand from Cedar Hollow. Instead, I was greeted by a voice, small, trembling, and filled with desperation. "Dr. Calloway?" "Yes." "Who is this?" "My name is Anna. I don't know who else to call. You have to help me." Her words tumbled out in a rush, her voice thick with panic. "My baby, Ellie. She's sick. I don't know what to do. The clinics are gone, and the barricades, they won't let us leave." "Slow down," I said, gripping the phone tighter. "Where are you calling from?" "Cedar Hollow," she whispered. My breath caught. "We've been inside since the quarantine started," Anna continued, her voice breaking. "I thought we were safe. I haven't touched anyone, I swear. But Ellie, she has these red spots, and she's burning up." "Do you have video?" I asked. He paused. Then, "Yes." "Hold on." Minutes later, her face appeared on my computer screen. She looked gaunt, her skin pale and glistening with sweat. Her infant daughter, Ellie, lay limp in her arms, her tiny body dotted with faint, pinkish rashes. "She won't eat," Anna said, tears streaking her face. "She barely cries anymore." I studied the image, my heart sinking. The signs were subtle, but I knew what they meant. "Anna," I said gently, "you need to get Ellie to a hospital. Right away." "I tried," she cried. "They won't let us out. The soldiers said they'd shoot if anyone crossed the barricade. Please, Dr. Calloway, you have to come. I'll do anything. Just save my baby." Her voice broke on the last word, and I felt something inside me crack. The weight of the decision. When the call ended, I sat in my office, staring at the blank screen. My hands trembled as I rubbed my face, exhaustion pressing down like a vice. I wanted to help her. God, I wanted to help her. But how? The hospital was still under quarantine. leaving was suicide, not just for me, but for anyone I might infect along the way. And even if I made it to Cedar Hollow, what then? The town was a wasteland, its streets crawling with the infected and the terrified. But the image of Anna's face haunted me, her desperation, her helplessness. "You can go," Elaine's voice cut through my thoughts. She was seated in a wheelchair by the door, her skin pale but her gaze sharp. "You heard the call," I said. "I heard a mother begging you to do the impossible," she replied. "You step outside this hospital and you're not coming back. You know that. She has a child, Aline, a baby." "And so does everyone else in that town," she said, her tone softening. "You think saving one of them will stop this? It won't. You'll just be another body added to the pile." Her words cut deep, but they didn't extinguish the fire inside me. The breaking point. I couldn't sleep that night. I couldn't eat. All I could see was Anna clutching her child, waiting for help that would never come. By morning, the infection in Cedar Hollow had reached a tipping point. Entire blocks were overrun with the sick and the dying. Riots broke out near the barricades, and soldiers fired warning shots to push back the mobs. And in the middle of it all, Anna's call played on repeat in my mind. I didn't know if I could save her, but I didn't know if I could live with myself if I didn't try. End of entry. Chapter 9. Breakthrough. Aaron Calloway's journal. Entry 9. Breakthroughs are supposed to bring relief, hope, a sense that the tide is finally turning. But this breakthrough was different. This one came wrapped in fire and ash, carrying the weight of choices I wasn't sure I could make. The eureka moment. It was Harper who noticed it first. We were in the containment lab, staring down at yet another failed antibiotic test. Dozens of samples had been exposed to the strongest treatments we had, carbapenems, cephalosporins, even experimental combinations. None of them worked. The bacteria shrugged them off like rain on a coat. But Harper had been running additional tests on the side, experimenting with environmental variables. "Wait a second," he murmured, leaning closer to the incubator. I turned toward him, startled by the sudden shift in his tone. "What is it?" He gestured for me to come over. Inside the incubator, a sample of the bacteria, one of the superbug strains mutated by the cylinder, was dead. Not diminished, not struggling, dead. "What did you do?" I asked, my voice taut with disbelief. "I exposed it to a combination of UV radiation and sustained heat," he said. His voice was shaking, equal parts excitement and horror. "I didn't think it would work, but I didn't think it would work. But look." The bacteria had been eradicated, its cell walls ruptured beyond repair. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. "Can we replicate it?" I asked. "Maybe," Papa said cautiously, "but there's a problem." Of course there was a problem. Scaling the cure. The process Harper had discovered wasn't simple. The bacteria didn't just die from high temperatures or UV radiation alone. It required both in a precise combination. Sustained heat above 140 degrees Fahrenheit and targeted ultraviolet light for several minutes. In a controlled environment, like the lab, It worked beautifully. But in the real world, in a hospital teeming with infection, or an entire town like Cedar Hollow, it was almost impossible. "We can't just heat an entire hospital," Harper said, shaking his head. "And even if we could, we'd risk killing the patients. Same with UV. The intensity we need would blind or burn anyone exposed to it." "So what are you saying?" I demanded, the hope in my chest faltering. "I'm saying this cure isn't scalable, not without—" He trailed off, avoiding my eyes. "It without what?" He hesitated before answering, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Localized incineration." The grim proposal. I stared at him, the words hanging in the air like smoke. "You're suggesting we burn them?" I said flatly. "I'm suggesting we think realistically," Harper countered. "The infection spreads through skin flora. It's not just on them, it's in them. Heat and radiation kill the bacteria, but there's no way to target it without targeting the host." I turned away, running a hand through my hair. The thought was unthinkable. "There has to be another way," I said. "There isn't," Harper replied, his voice hardening. "This thing is mutating faster than we can study it. You've seen what it does. If we don't act now, there won't be anyone left to save." A test case. Against my better judgment, I agreed to a trial. A single patient in the advanced stages of the infection, a man who had already been declared terminal, was moved into a sterilized chamber outfitted with Harper's makeshift setup. The process was brutal. The patient screamed as the heat lamps flared, sweat pouring off his body as his skin blistered and burned. "Shut it down," I shouted, unable to watch any longer. Harper hesitated, then flipped the switch. The lights dimmed and the chamber filled with silence, save for the patient's ragged breathing. When we entered, the man was alive, but barely. His skin was scorched and his body trembled with the effort of holding on. But the bacteria was gone. "It worked," Harper said quietly. I looked at the patient, his face a mask of pain, and felt no victory. The moral dilemma. That night I sat alone in my office, staring at the empty whiteboard where we'd been mapping out possible treatments. The test had proven that the bacteria could be eradicated. But at what cost? How could I justify subjecting patients to such a barbaric procedure? And if we did nothing, how many more would die suffering just as much, if not more? I thought of Anna, the mother from Cedar Hollow. A baby's face flashed in my mind, feverish and fragile. Could I look her in the eyes and tell her there was no hope? Or worse, could I tell her the cure might destroy her just as surely as the disease? The first step. Hopper came to me the next morning, his expression grim. "I know you're struggling with this," he said, "but we don't have time to debate morality. The infection is winning. If we don't act, it'll spread beyond this hospital, beyond Cedar Hollow. It'll be everywhere." His words hung in the air, heavy with truth. "I'll authorize a second trial," I said finally, "but no more than that. If we can't refine the process to make it safe, it's off the table." Harper nodded, though I could see the doubt in his eyes. As he left, I turned back to the whiteboard, gripping the marker so tightly my knuckles turned white. We were standing on the edge of a knife, balancing between salvation and damnation. And for the first time in my career, I wasn't sure which side we'd fall on. End of entry. Chapter 10. Sabotage. Drayon Calloway's Journal Entry 10. The sound of the explosion wasn't loud, but it echoed through the hospital like a thunderclap. It happened just after midnight, when the quiet hours had stretched thin, and the weight of desperation hung thick in the air. I was in my office, poring over containment protocols that felt more futile with each passing day, when the tremor rattled the walls. A second later, the alarms began to blare. The fracture. By the time I reached the containment lab, chaos was already in full swing. The heavy double doors had been blown open, and acrid smoke poured into the corridor. Inside, Harper was on his knees, coughing violently, while a group of staff stood in a semicircle around the cylinder. Or what was left of it. It had been tipped off its platform, lying on its side like a gutted animal. The crack we'd been studying had widened into a gaping wound, and a thick plume of shimmering gas curled out into the room, like a living thing tasting the air. "What the hell have you done?" I shouted, my voice cutting through the cacophony. One of the staff members turned to me, Patel, the young resident who had already been teetering on the edge of sanity. His face was streaked with sweat and grime, and his eyes blazed with a mixture of fear and defiance. "We had to do it," he said, his voice shaking. "That thing is the source. Destroy it, and this nightmare ends." "You didn't destroy it," I snapped, advancing toward him. "You just made it worse." The gas escapes. The vapor was spreading fast, seeping into the ventilation system and curling along the floor like mist. I could already feel the sharp sting in my throat, the same acrid bite I'd first noticed at the scrapyard. "Get out of here," I barked at the staff. "Now." Some of them hesitated, their fear rooting them to the spot. "Now," I repeated, my voice cracking. That got them moving. I turned to Harper, who was still coughing into his sleeve. His eyes met mine, wide with alarm. "The vents," he wheezed. "If it gets into the air system..." I didn't let him finish. I grabbed the emergency lockdown switch on the wall and pulled it with all my strength. Sealing the wings. The hospital's containment system groaned to life, heavy steel doors slamming shut at key junctions. The hiss of sealing mechanisms filled the air, cutting off entire wings in a matter of minutes. "Evacuate anyone in Wing C," I shouted into my radio, my voice tight with urgency. "Get them to the north wing before the barriers seal completely." The response crackled back, distorted by static. "There's no time, Dr. Calloway. We've got patients trapped." I closed my eyes, the weight of the decision crushing me. There was no way to save everyone. If I didn't seal the wing, the gas would continue to spread, infecting every corner of the hospital. "Seal it," I said quietly. "Do it," I roared, slamming my fist against the wall. The fallout. The gas wasn't just spreading, it was evolving. Patients and staff in the affected areas began exhibiting symptoms faster than ever before. Lesions that once took hours to develop now appeared within minutes. Fevers climbed to lethal levels in half the time. And then there were the neurological effects. The first report came from a nurse in Wing C. "Dr. Calloway," she said over the radio, her voice trembling. "One of the patients, he's laughing." Laughing? I repeated, confused. He's burning up, covered in lesions, and he's laughing. It's not normal. It's like he doesn't even know what's happening to him. The infection was no longer just physical. It was clawing into the minds of its victims, breaking them from the inside out. Confrontation. Later that night, after the immediate crisis had settled into a grim, uneasy calm, I found Patel in the cafeteria. He was sitting at a corner table, his head in his hands. "What were you thinking?" I demanded, slamming my hands down on the table. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "I was trying to save us," he whispered. "Save us. You've killed more people than you've saved." "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising. "That thing, it's evil. It's not just bacteria, Calloway. It's alive. It's playing with us. If we don't destroy it—" "You've seen what happens when we try to destroy it," I interrupted. "The gas is out. Now, Patel, the infection is spreading faster than ever, and it's because of you." He stared at me, his expression crumbling. I just wanted it to stop. For the first time, I saw him for what he really was, not a threat, but a man consumed by fear. The unseen enemy. I left Patel in the cafeteria and returned to my office, where the hospital's blueprints were spread across my desk. The sealed wings were holding, for now, but the gas was unpredictable. Every minute it stayed in the building was another minute the infection had to adapt, to find new ways to spread. The cylinder was still in the containment lab, leaking its poison into the air. Destroying it wasn't an option, not anymore. But leaving it intact felt like waiting for the axe to fall. I stared at the blueprints, searching for answers that didn't exist. My hands trembled as I picked up a pen, the weight of the day crashing down on me. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't sure if we could win. End of entry. Chapter 11. Survivor's Guilt. Dear Aaron Calloway's Journal, Entry 11. The basement was never meant to be a refuge. It was cold, damp, and suffocatingly quiet, broken only by the humph of the ventilation system and the occasional cough from one of the few staff who had made it down here. This wasn't where doctors worked. This was where we hid. The retreat. After the sabotage, and there was nowhere else to go. Oh, the patients' overlapped floors were overrun. Patients in advanced stages of infection screamed and thrashed in their beds, the gas continuing to seep into sealed-off areas despite our best efforts. We'd retreated here to the depths of Greenbridge Memorial, dragging what equipment we could carry. A single generator powered the lab equipment, and someone had rigged a makeshift ventilation system to keep the air breathable. We were a skeleton crew now, 6 of us, clinging to the thin hope that we could still find a way out of this nightmare. Hopper was here, of course, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. Sarah had joined us too, though she barely spoke, her face a mask of silent anguish. The guilt. Everywhere I looked, I saw ghosts. Elaine's room on the 4th floor had been sealed off during the sabotage. She was one of the patients we couldn't evacuate in time. Her face haunted me, the way she had gripped my hand during our last conversation, the way she had whispered, "Don't give up," even as the infection consumed her. I thought about Patel, curled up in the cafeteria, and the janitors who had stayed behind to clean contaminated wings. I thought about the patients who had begged me to save them, the ones whose cries had faded into silence. I had failed them all. You can't save everyone. That's what Harper had told me when we retreated to the basement. But that wasn't the point. I hadn't saved anyone. The infection spreads. The first report came over the emergency radio we'd salvaged. Outbreak reported in Middleton, the voice crackled. Multiple cases presenting with lesions, fever, and severe neurological symptoms. Middleton, a city 20 miles away. Confirmed outbreak in East Lake, the radio announced later, sending a fresh wave of dread through the room. Urgent request for CDC assistance. East Lake was 50 miles out. The infection wasn't contained anymore. It had escaped Cedar Hollow, slipped past Greenbridge Memorial, and begun carving a path of destruction through the surrounding cities. "How?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "How? Is it spreading? We've been locked down for days." Harper stared at the radio, his face pale. "The carriers," he said quietly. "The asymptomatic ones. Someone must have gotten out before we realized what was happening." I clenched my fists, anger boiling in my chest. We had done everything right, or as close to right as anyone could under these circumstances, but it hadn't been enough. The weight of responsibility. That night, I sat alone in the corner of the basement, staring at the dim glow of the monitors we'd salvaged. A single microscope sat on the table in front of me, next to a sample of the bacteria we'd been studying for days. This tiny organism, so small it was invisible to the naked eye, had brought us to our knees. It had taken Elaine, Patel, and every patient I'd ever sworn to protect. And now it was out there, spreading like wildfire, unstoppable and unseen. I buried my face in my hands, the weight of it all pressing down on me like a physical force. I wasn't just failing the people in this hospital. I was failing everyone. A glimmer of hope. "Dr. Calloway," Harper's voice cut through the silence, startling me. I looked up to see him standing in the doorway, holding a clipboard. His expression was grim, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of determination I hadn't seen in days. "We need to keep working," he said simply. I nodded, pulling myself to my feet. "Let's go," I said, my voice hoarse. The 6 of us gathered around the lab bench, our movements slow and deliberate. Every step forward felt like wading through quicksand, but we kept going. Because as long as we were still alive, the fight wasn't over. End of entry. Chapter 12. Sacrifice. Dr. Aaron Calloway's journal. Entry 12. Her name was Sarah. She wasn't just another nurse. She was the glue that held this hospital together, even when it was falling apart. And now she was the reason we had a chance to fight back. The decision. Sarah's symptoms had progressed rapidly over the past 2 days. The once subtle lesions on her arms had grown into angry, blistering sores. Her fever spiked to dangerous levels, and every breath seemed to rattle in her chest. I caught her staring at the radiation chamber we had assembled in the basement. It was a crude thing, heat lamps rigged to UV projectors, but it was our only shot at controlling the infection. "You're thinking about volunteering, aren't you?" I asked quietly, stepping beside her. She didn't flinch. "We need to know if it works, Erin," she said. Her voice steadied despite her fragile state. "And I'm already infected. Better me than someone else." "Sarah, we can't—" "You can," she interrupted, turning to face me. Her eyes burned with determination, even as her body betrayed her. "You have to. If this works, you can save lives. If it doesn't, I'd rather go down fighting than waiting to die." The preparation. The hours leading up to the test were a blur of activity and quiet dread. Harper calibrated the equipment, checking and rechecking every setting. I reviewed Sarah's vitals, my hands shaking as I placed the heart monitor leads on her chest. She smiled faintly at me. "You always were the warrior," she teased. I tried to smile back, but I couldn't. "You don't have to do this," I said one last time. "Yes, I do," she replied firmly. As we sealed her into the chamber, I realized I'd never felt so powerless. The experiment. The heat lamps flared to life, bathing the chamber in a harsh orange glow. The temperature climbed rapidly, sweat pooling on Sarah's brow as she gritted her teeth against the pain. "Vitals holding steady," Harper said, his voice tight with concentration. I watched through the glass as Sarah clenched her fists, her body trembling. The UV projectors activated next, flooding the chamber with blinding light. The bacteria didn't stand a chance. We could see the lesions on her arms darken and blister further as the infection died under the onslaught of heat and radiation. The monitors showed a dramatic drop in her white blood cell count, a sign that the immune system was no longer fighting an active infection. "It's working," Harper whispered. But Sarah's body couldn't keep up. The cost. Her breathing became labored as the heat and radiation took their toll. I pounded on the intercom, my voice shaking. "Sarah, we're shutting it down. Hang on!" "Now," she gasped, her voice hoarse. "Finish it. Do it for them." Her words were a knife to my chest, but I obeyed. The procedure ran its full course, and when we finally opened the chamber, Sarah was still. Her skin was burned, her body fragile, but her face was calm, peaceful. "Lingsoff is gone," Harper said softly, his voice thick with grief. I collapsed into a chair, staring at her lifeless body. The infection was gone, but so was Sarah. The inspiration. Later that night, as the others mourned in silence, I sat in the corner of the lab, replaying every moment of the experiment in my mind. Sarah's sacrifice had proven the treatment worked. But the process was too extreme. No one could survive it. Then an idea struck me. The chamber had worked because it targeted the bacteria on her skin and within her tissues. But what if we didn't need direct exposure? What if we could scale it up, treat entire areas instead of individuals? My mind raced as I sketched out a plan. We could use industrial heat generators combined with UV towers to sterilize entire wings of the hospital. Patients and staff could be evacuated to shielded areas, sparing them from the worst effects while eradicating the infection in their surroundings. It was risky. It was dangerous. But it might be our only chance. The first step. The next morning, I presented the plan to Harper and the others. "It's ambitious," he said, frowning at my sketches, "and we don't have the resources to cover the whole hospital." "Then we start small," I said. "One wing at a time. We clear the space, treat it, and move on." "And if it doesn't work?" Sarah's absence was a heavy silence in the room, but her determination lingered. "Then at least we'll know we tried," I said. The legacy. Sarah's sacrifice had given us a weapon, a way to fight back against the infection. As we began preparations for the first sterilization run, I felt a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks. But that hope was tempered by loss. Every step forward came at a price, and Sarah had paid the ultimate one. I vowed that we wouldn't waste it. We wouldn't let her death be in vain. End of entry. Chapter 13, Cedar Hollow's End. Aaron Calloway's journal, entry 13. The screen flickered, casting an eerie blue glow across the basement lab. We gathered around, silent, watching as Cedar Hollow burned. It wasn't a wildfire or a natural disaster. It wasn't an accident. It was a calculated, deliberate act of destruction. And I couldn't look away. The announcement. The first warning came through the emergency radio at dawn. All residents of Cedar Hollow are advised to remain in their homes. The situation is under control. Please await further instructions. The voice was flat, sterile, almost robotic. It didn't sound like someone speaking to a terrified population. It sounded like someone issuing a death sentence. An hour later, the hospital's satellite feed picked up the first images. Military vehicles rolling into Cedar Hollow's perimeter, drones circling overhead, the town's streets eerily empty. "What are they doing?" Sarah asked, her voice hushed. I didn't answer. I already knew. The flames began. The first explosion came just after noon. A bright flash lit up the screen, followed by a thick plume of smoke rising into the sky. "They're using incendiaries," Harper said, his tone a mix of horror and fascination. That's not containment." The drone swept low, dropping payloads into the center of town. Fires erupted in neat, methodical patterns, each one expanding outward until entire blocks were engulfed. "They're burning it," I whispered, my voice barely audible. For a moment no one spoke. The crackle of the radio filled the silence, interspersed with faint, distant screams. "This isn't containment," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "This is extermination. The ethics of despair." I couldn't tear my eyes from the screen. Cedar Hollow had been a quiet, unremarkable town, a place where people lived and loved and grew old. Now it was a pyre, its streets reduced to ash and rubble, its people erased. "They're killing everyone," I said, my chest tightening. "Infected or not." "They don't have a choice," Harper said, though he didn't sound convinced. "There's always a choice," I shot back. "Look at what happened here," he argued, gesturing around the lab. Look at what's happening in Middleton, in Eastlake. This infection doesn't stop. If Cedar Hollow gets out of control, it's over for all of us." And you think this is the answer?" I demanded. "Burning an entire town? Killing innocent people just to keep the infection contained?" Harper didn't reply. He didn't have to. The Foundation's hand. It wasn't long before we received confirmation of what I'd suspected all along. Yes, the SCP Foundation had orchestrated the operation. Their methods were efficient, ruthless, and horrifyingly effective. They didn't just burn Cedar Hollow, they erased it. By the time the fires burned out, there wouldn't be anything left. No survivors, no evidence, no memory of the town that once stood there. "This is what they do," Harper said quietly. "Containment at any cost." "And the cylinder?" I asked. "What about that? Are they going to destroy it too?" Harper hesitated. "They want it contained, studied." I stared at him, my stomach twisting. They're gonna study it? After all this? After everything it's done? "It's the only way to understand it," he said. "If we destroy it, we lose any chance of finding answers." "And if they can't control it," I asked, my voice rising, "what happens when it escapes again? How many more Cedar Hollows will there be?" The weight of the decision. That night, I sat alone in the basement, staring at the faint glow of the monitors. The satellite feed had gone dark, but the images of Cedar Hollow burning were seared into my mind. I thought about the cylinder sitting in the containment lab, leaking its silent poison. It was the source of everything: the infection, the deaths, the destruction of an entire town. Destroying it felt like the only logical choice. But what if Harper was right? What if the cylinder held answers we couldn't afford to lose? My hands shook as I gripped my pen, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. Was I willing to risk more lives for the sake of knowledge? Or was I willing to destroy something we barely understood, knowing it might be the only key to stopping this nightmare for good? The legacy of ash. Cedar Hollow was gone. And as I sat there, the enormity of what had been done, and what might still be done, hung over me like a shadow. The infection wasn't just consuming bodies, it was consuming everything: our morals, our humanity, our ability to see the line between right and wrong. I had to make a choice, and I wasn't sure if I had the strength to make it. End of entry. Chapter 14. The Final Stand. Dr. Aaron Calloway's Journal, Entry 14. By Olith. The infection was everywhere now, clinging to the walls, lurking in the air, festering on every surface. Greenbridge Memorial wasn't a hospital anymore. It was a battleground. And we were losing. Critical mass. The first sign that we'd reached the breaking point came when the sterilization process failed in Wing C. We'd cleared the area, herding the last few patients and staff into a sealed corridor before activating the heat and UV treatment. It should have worked. It had worked before. But this time, when the doors reopened, the walls were still crawling with lesions. The air had a sharp, acidic tang that burned my throat. The bacteria hadn't just survived. It had adapted. "This thing is learning," Harper said grimly as we retreated to the basement. "It's evolving faster than we can keep up." "How long do we have?" I asked. He didn't answer. The agents arrive. The SCP agents arrived that night. I was in the middle of prepping another sterilization unit when I heard the heavy thud of boots echoing through the hallways. The air shifted, the weight of their presence palpable even before they appeared. They moved like shadows, faceless figures in black tactical gear, their weapons trained on anything that moved. At their center was a man in a pristine suit, his expression sharp and unreadable. "Dr. Calloway," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "we're here for the cylinder." The revelation. The agents didn't waste time with pleasantries. "The object you're dealing with is classified as SCP-047, the man explained. His tone clipped. "It emits a mutagenic gas that targets bacterial organisms, accelerating their evolution and pathogenicity. We've been monitoring its effects since Cedar Hollow." "Monitoring?" I spat. "Is that what you call letting an entire town burn?" His expression didn't waver. Cedar Hollow was necessary. Containment takes precedence over all else. "Containment?" I repeated, incredulous. "You call this containment?" He ignored me, his focus razor-sharp. "The cylinder needs to be secured immediately. Your efforts here are irrelevant. You've already lost control." A standoff. I stepped in front of the lab door, my heart pounding. "You're not taking it," I said firmly. The agents bristled, their weapons rising slightly. "Dr. Calloway," the suited man said, his tone measured but cold, "our health insurance is only for doctors." "You don't understand," I said, my voice shaking but resolute. "This thing can't be controlled. Every time we try, it gets worse. If you take it, you'll just be moving the problem somewhere else, risking more lives, more outbreaks." "But it's not your decision to make," he said, stepping closer. "You're out of your depth." "And you're playing with fire," I snapped. "This thing isn't just a biohazard, it's a weapon. If you let it loose again, it won't stop. Cedar Hollow will look like a footnote." The tension in the room was suffocating. Harper stood behind me, silent but supportive. The agents' weapons gleamed under the dim fluorescent lights, their barrels pointed directly at us. A desperate gamble. I raised my hands slowly, trying to keep my voice calm. "If you want the cylinder," I said, "then help us destroy it. Right here, right now." We've developed a sterilization method. It's not perfect, but it can work. If we combine it with a controlled incineration. "That's not an option," the agent interrupted. "Not?" I demanded. "What's so important about this thing that you'd risk the entire world to keep it intact?" The suited man hesitated for the first time. "It's not your concern." His deflection only fueled my resolve. "You can't control it," I said, stepping closer. "You know that. You've seen what it does. If you take it, you're dooming us all." The breaking point. The room felt like it was about to explode. The agents shifted uneasily, their weapons still trained on me. Harper's breathing was shallow behind me, and I could feel the weight of every choice I'd made pressing down on my shoulders. Then the suited man lowered his voice, leaning in. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," he said quietly. "This isn't just about Greenbridge. This is about humanity's survival, The Foundation's methods may seem harsh, but they are necessary." "Necessary?" I echoed. "You're not saving humanity. You're sacrificing it." I turned to Harper. "Activate the sterilization unit," I said. "Aaron," he started, his voice filled with hesitation. "Do it," I insisted. The agents raised their weapons again, the tension snapping like a wire pulled too tight. "This is your last warning, Calloway," the suited man said, his voice icy. "Go ahead," I said. "Shoot me, but you won't make it out of here with that cylinder." The turning tide. The next moments were a blur. Harper slammed his hand on the activation panel, and the sterilization system roared to life. Heat and ultraviolet light flooded the room, forcing everyone to retreat. The agents barked orders, but they couldn't stop what had already begun. The cylinder shuddered under the intense heat, its surface glowing faintly as the gas began to dissipate. For a moment I thought we'd succeeded. Then it cracked. A fissure split down its side, releasing a final plume of shimmering vapor. "Seal the lab!" I shouted, pulling Harper toward the exit. The agents hesitated, torn between retrieving the cylinder and saving themselves. In the end, they chose survival. The aftermath. We sealed the lab, trapping the cylinder and the infection inside. The sterilization process would continue until there was nothing left to study, nothing left to spread. I stood outside the sealed doors, my chest heaving, my mind racing. "You realize what you've done," the suited man said, his voice filled with quiet fury. "I saved lives," I replied. "Or doomed them," he shot back. "This isn't over, Calloway, not by a long shot." As the agents retreated into the shadows, I felt no relief. Because he was right. This wasn't over. End of entry. Chapter 15. The Rust Lingers. Dr. Aaron Calloway's final entry. "They say you can't fight fate." I never believed that. I thought science could bend the arc of destiny, force the universe to yield to logic and discovery. But standing here, staring at the cylinder as it glows faintly under the relentless pressure of our sterilization chamber, I realize I was wrong. Fate isn't a straight line, it's a spiral, curling tighter and tighter, dragging us into the center. And at the center of this spiral, there is only rust. The last stand. The cylinder sat in the containment lab, its fractured surface pulsing faintly, almost alive. The sterilization process had slowed the infection but hadn't stopped it. Every minute we waited, the gas seeped through the cracks, tainting the air, adapting, learning. We were out of time. "Dr. Calloway," Harper said, his voice barely audible. "If we keep this up, it'll destabilize." "That's the point," I replied, not looking at him. He hesitated. "If it goes, it could... Well, we don't know what'll happen." "I know," I said quietly. "But we don't have another choice. Destroying the source." The decision wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The cylinder had to be destroyed, no matter the cost. I adjusted the sterilization chamber's controls, overriding the safety protocols. The heat lamps flared brighter, and the UV projectors hummed with deadly intensity. Harper's protest faded into the background as I focused, my hand steady for the first time in days. "Do you think this will end it?" Harper asked. I didn't answer. I didn't know. As the chamber reached critical levels, the cylinder began to crack further. A faint, keening sound filled the room, like metal screaming under pressure. Then it exploded. The chain reaction. The blast wasn't violent. It wasn't fire or shrapnel. It was worse. A plume of spores erupted from the cylinder's remains, glowing faintly in the sterilization lights. They moved like smoke, curling through the air with terrifying purpose. I stumbled back, my breath catching as the first tendrils brushed against my skin. "Aaron!" Harper shouted, pulling me toward the emergency seal. "Go!" I rasped, pushing him away. "You're exposed." "They want you to find your evil partner. Elephant, shark, bear, more bears." I said, "Go, seal the lab." He hesitated, torn between his own survival and his instinct to stay. But eventually he ran, the heavy doors slamming shut behind him. The rust within. I stood in the center of the lab, surrounded by the swirling spores. My skin burned where they touched, the infection seeping into me with cruel efficiency. I staggered to the nearest console, forcing my trembling hands to type. If I was going to die, someone had to know. Someone had to be warned. "The spores," I murmured into the recorder, my voice weak. "They're a failsafe. The gas mutates bacteria, but the spores, they're something else. Dormant, waiting, ready to spread. Destroying the cylinder didn't end it. It just changed the rules." Final thoughts. As I collapsed to the floor, I thought of Elaine, her voice urging me to keep fighting. I felt Sarah, her sacrifice, giving us the strength to push forward. I thought of Cedar Hollow, burning to ash, and the faceless agents who had come to clean up the mess. And I thought of the future, the researchers who would find this site, who would read my notes, who would try to finish what we started. "This isn't over," I whispered. "It will never be over. But you can't stop fighting. Don't let it win. Don't let it It was trailed off, lost to the darkness spreading through my body. The Foundation's cleanup. The SCP Foundation arrived hours later, their hazmat suits gleaming under the harsh lights of the hospital's upper floors. They moved with precision, sealing off the basement and retrieving what little remained of the cylinder. My notes were taken, cataloged, and redacted. The hospital was sterilized, its walls scrubbed of every visible trace of the infection. And yet, whispers began to emerge, rumors of isolated cases in nearby towns, strange lesions appearing on people who had never set foot in Greenbridge. The infection wasn't gone. It was waiting. The legacy of rust. Somewhere, in the darkness of a forgotten town, another cylinder waits, another spiral begins. And as the spores drift through the air, settling into the cracks of the world, the rust lingers. And eventually,